1863, South Carolina Lowcountry. Dozens of armed men, riders and dogs against one lone fugitive. It is the impossible paradox that history often forgets, drowned out by the thunder of the Great War raging elsewhere. But here, in the oppressive silence of the cypress swamp, a different kind of conflict was taking shape. A reckoning waged not with cannons, but with sheer, unforgiving intellect and a deep understanding of the deadly terrain. You believe you understand resistance. You imagine brute force or frantic flight. But what unfolded in the coastal plains surrounding the Ashley and Cooper rivers was a masterclass in psychological warfare and strategic logistics, executed by a woman named Cora. A woman who understood that the system designed to enslave her could, if studied closely enough, be transformed into her own lethal weapon. In the next hour, we will dissect the records and the oral histories passed down through generations, the tactical blueprints left behind in scorched earth and failed pursuit logs. You will discover how Cora mapped the wilderness with the precision of a military engineer, how she utilized the very laws designed to capture her, the reliance on bounty hunters, the predictable routes, the arrogance of the overseers, to dissolve entire search parties, turning the hunters into the hunted long before the first great fire ever touched the fields. This is not a story of a simple escape. This is the documented account of how one individual, through planning and cold resolve, brought 4 established towns to their knees. The low country of South Carolina in 1863 was a character in itself, a hostile, suffocating entity. The air was thick and heavy, smelling perpetually of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. It was a region where the heat didn't just wear down the body, it broke the mind. The legal framework of the time, cemented by the iron grip of the Fugitive Slave Act, created a massive, coordinated mechanism for retrieval. Plantation owners, local militias, and professional bounty hunters viewed escape as an economic insult, and pursuit was immediate, relentless, and supported by infinite local resources. They operated with supreme confidence. A single runaway, they believed, would be cold, hungry, and panicked, a creature of instinct easily tracked by experienced dogs and riders. But Cora was neither cold nor panicked. Weeks, possibly months prior to her ultimate decision, she had begun a campaign of silent, meticulous preparation. Her intelligence gathering was paramount. Working primarily in the fields, she observed the rotations of the guards, the watering schedules for the horses, the habits of the best tracking hounds, and, most crucially, the routes of resupply used by the various neighboring plantations that formed a protective economic web across the region. Cora understood the geography of control. The plantations relied on open fields and navigable roads for efficiency. The wilderness, the vast, tangled coastal swamp, was perceived as a barrier, not a sanctuary. This was their first mistake. Cora's tactical plan centered on 2 core principles: logistical superiority and complete control of the movement corridor. She didn't seek distance, she sought control of the immediate environment. Her first step was environmental mapping. At night, or during mandated breaks, she didn't rest. She learned the terrain's hidden language, the narrow, elevated islands within the swamp that offered dry rest spots, the specific density of the thicket that slowed a horse to a halt, and the points where brackish water turned suddenly potable. She created a series of small, dispersed caches. These were not random hiding spots, they were sophisticated multi-purpose stores designed to sustain a long siege. In one cache, deep within the roots of a colossal cypress tree, were iron tools suitable for minor sabotage and defense. In another, strategically placed near a sluggish stream, she stored salted provisions, hardtack and dried venison, prepared over time by sacrificing minor portions of her own meager rations. Crucially, these caches contain materials not just for survival, but for strategic deception: scraps of cloth, strong-smelling herbs and animal oils designed to confuse the olfactory senses of the best tracking dogs. The very air, she planned, would lie to the men hunting her. The first alarm was raised at dawn, marked by the discovery of an empty cabin and a clean, chilling absence of struggle. The overseers reacted with textbook speed and arrogance. This was their routine, their predictable response. Within hours, a massive mounted pursuit, the first wave, was dispatched, composed of the resident field drivers, the head overseer, and a half-dozen of the most aggressive local bounty hunters eager for the reward. Their confidence was palpable. They rode hard, expecting to overtake her before nightfall. They carried sufficient water for a day, expecting the fugitive to be predictable, heading toward the north or the nearest major river. But Cora had not traveled north. She had plunged immediately into the deepest part of the marshland, adjacent to the plantation boundary, a section the riders knew to avoid due to its treacherous footing. The trackers, mounted and impatient, immediately hit the first elements of Cora's defensive perimeter. Not physical barriers, but psychological and logistical traps. The hounds, highly prized and highly effective, were crucial to the hunters. Cora had anticipated this reliance. The first trails they found were exaggerated, leading sharply west toward a dense patch of stagnant, acidic water. As the dogs plunged in, their highly tuned senses were overwhelmed not by human scent, but by the application of certain oils and pungent swamp herbs deployed hours earlier. The scent was there, but it was corrupted, distorted, leading the dogs into confusion and exhaustion. "She's circling back," the lead bounty hunter surmised, his voice heavy with initial frustration. They wasted valuable hours following these phantom trails, their horses tiring quickly in the unexpectedly difficult terrain, their initial supplies of drinking water dwindling fast. The first major setback arrived unexpectedly, a testament to Cora's foresight. Along a narrow, barely visible deer path that the pursuers were forced to follow single file, a seemingly minor obstruction, a cleverly repositioned cluster of heavy, jagged branches, forced the riders to dismount and clear the path. In the humid heat and under the pressure of the pursuit, the delay was minor but strategically vital. It was during this delay that one of the horses, tied carelessly in the momentary frustration, vanished. Not violently, but simply gone. A quick, silent severing of the reins, achieved with a sharpened shard of iron from Cora's tactical cache. The loss of a single horse, while not crippling, was an immense logistical erosion. It meant one man was now walking, slowing the pace of the entire party and forcing them to reallocate precious water and morale. The first wave had lost its unity and its speed, hours into the chase. This transition marked the beginning of the second wave of pursuit, an escalation fueled by rising anger and the painful realization that they were chasing a calculated ghost. The local sheriff, sensing the immediate failure of the plantation staff, mobilized a larger contingent of local militia, men less familiar with the swamp, but armed with superior firepower and a mandate for swift retribution. These new pursuers expected to find the remnants of the first search party, perhaps wounded or demoralized. Instead, they found them scattered, exhausted, and arguing amongst themselves. The lead overseer was dehydrated and furious, railing against the wilderness itself. The second wave adopted a systematic approach, spreading out in a grid pattern. This played directly into Cora's hands. Isolation was her ally. The swamp became a labyrinth of engineered misery. Cora began exploiting the tactical necessity of communication. In this dense environment, visual contact was often impossible, forcing the search parties to rely on auditory signals, shouts, whistles, and horn calls. Cora, having meticulously studied these patterns, began deploying decoys. She used the deep, echoing acoustics of the marsh to her advantage. Minor disturbances, a thrown stone, a quickly snapped branch, a fabricated call mimicking a wounded animal, would be deployed miles ahead or far to the flank of a segmented search group. This noise pollution forced the militia to constantly divert resources, chasing shadows and stretching their lines until they broke. The cumulative effect of exhaustion and strategic misdirection began to manifest as acute paranoia. Men, separated by only 100 yards of thicket, began reporting contradictory sightings. One group swore they smelled smoke to the south. Another was certain they heard the sound of chopping wood far to the north. Every shadow became a threat, every sudden silence a trap. The environment, once perceived as merely inconvenient, was now viewed as actively hostile, controlled by an unseen enemy. One patrol was forced to retreat entirely after their supply cache, intended for a week-long hunt, was found emptied and contaminated with swamp silt and animal waste. This was not the work of a desperate fugitive. This was the methodical sabotage of a highly intelligent opponent aiming to cripple their endurance. The system had begun to collapse in on itself, relying on logistical structures that Cora had already mapped and systematically dismantled. By the time the third wave began, marked by the arrival of specialized, highly paid bounty hunters from Charleston, the psychological damage had been done. These seasoned professionals arrived expecting a routine tracking job. What they found was a demoralized collection of local men suffering from swamp fever and a debilitating fear. They were no longer hunting a person. They were navigating a deliberate, designed environment of constant threat. The bounty hunters were experts in tracking human movement, but Cora forced them to track her strategy. She never moved in a straight line. Her routes crisscrossed old riverbeds and followed animal tracks for miles before suddenly vanishing into thickets of razor grass. She left faint but deliberately misleading evidencias tácticas encontradas, a piece of clothing snagged on a thorn bush facing the wrong direction, a footprint slightly too large or too small for her actual size. The shift in the emotional landscape was total. The hunters realized with chilling certainty that the environment had been prepared for their arrival. They were operating in a confined, dangerous space where every advantage, food, water, clear navigation, belonged to the fugitive. The reckoning was swift and profound. The specialized pursuit teams, arrogant only days before, began to move like terrified soldiers in enemy territory. They communicated less, fearing their signals would be intercepted. They slept in shifts, haunted by the knowledge that Cora knew the swamp intimately, knew the silence, the sounds, the safe high ground, while they floundered in the heat and the mud. This intellectual superiority, the ability to turn environmental knowledge into tactical dominance, is precisely how Cora maintained her freedom and paved the way for the events that would follow. She survived the initial, most dangerous push, not through luck, but by executing a defensive strategy months in the making. She demonstrated that resistance was not merely about escaping the immediate reach of the plantation, but about forcing the established system to expend resources until the cost of the pursuit outweighed the value of the capture. The failures documented in the plantation ledgers were staggering. The cost of replacing the lost horses and dogs, the medical expenses for the sick and wounded men, and the sheer, immeasurable cost of time. 4 towns, connected by these same plantation networks, had devoted massive resources to finding one woman, only to see their efforts dissolved by shadow and swamp. Cora had neutralized the immediate threat. She was free, but she was not finished. The failure of the pursuit was only the prologue. The groundwork was laid, the enemy exhausted and demoralized. Now, with the fields ripe and vulnerable and the harvest imminent, Cora was ready to deploy the true, devastating impact of her strategy, moving from survival to full-scale strategic retaliation. The exhausted hunters, retreating silently from the swamp, had no idea that their loss was about to usher in a far greater catastrophe. 1863, coastal South Carolina. 35 armed men against one. This was the impossible paradox that unfolded in the thick, suffocating air of the Low Country, a battle not of strength, but of strategy and silent will. You are about to discover how Cora, operating alone in the most hostile environment imaginable, transformed the very system designed to capture her into her own perfect weapon, using documented records of the era and tactical survival expertise honed over a lifetime. This is not merely a tale of escape. It is the blueprint of a strategic reckoning. The preparation was silent. The fear that followed was deafening. Weeks before the final conflagration that would bring the economics of 4 neighboring towns, Georgetown, Beaufort, St. Helena, and even parts of Charleston County, to their knees, the shadow of Cora was already at work. It was a meticulous, chilling preparation, witnessed only by the moss-draped cypress and the relentless creeping vines of the ancient wilderness. The system she faced was monolithic, anchored by the infamous Fugitive Slave Act, which turned every civilian into a potential informant and every patch of free ground into a deadly trap. Legally, Cora was nothing more than property, a financial investment whose disappearance triggered immediate aggressive retaliation. But strategically, she was a cartographer, a logistical genius, and an architect of delayed collapse. The geography itself was the first hostile character in this drama. The Low Country of South Carolina in the summer of 1863 was a furnace of humidity, a labyrinth of tidal creeks, bottomless bogs, and dense, impenetrable swamp. For the established plantation owners and the professional bounty hunters, they hired men accustomed to open fields and clear trails. This environment was a necessary nuisance. For Cora, it was a sanctuary forged in mud and water, a canvas upon which she painted the impending failure of her pursuers. Cora's plan began long before the actual ignition of the harvest. It required months of meticulous observation, mapping the subtle weaknesses in the logistics of the plantations themselves. She understood that speed was suicide. Endurance and attrition were the only path to survival. She began creating what old military records later termed caches of denial. These were small, hidden stores placed strategically along the known pursuit routes the youngest overseers own. And trackers would logically assume a runaway would take. The stores were not for her use, but for subtle sabotage. She mapped freshwater sources then, using naturally occurring contaminants, though never poisons that would leave a paper trail, only those that caused severe, rapid incapacitation. She ensured key wells and streams along the primary tracking corridors would be unusable within 72 hours of her departure. She created decoy caches of spoiled feed and tack, placed just close enough to appear legitimate, guaranteeing that the high-strung, expensive pursuit horses would either be rendered useless by colic or become uncontrollable due to exhaustion and hunger. Tools were another focus. She hoarded lengths of industrial-grade wire, salvaged metal spikes, and robust cordage, not for direct defense, but for the creation of tactical obstacles. She didn't build clumsy pits. She engineered subtle ankle-height tripwires designed to break momentum and scatter personnel in thick undergrowth, maximizing the likelihood of separation and disorientation. When the news finally broke that Cora had vanished, and the smoke began to rise over the initial spectacular destruction of the stored rice and cotton harvest, the immediate response from the 4 linked towns was arrogance backed by deep financial panic. This was Onda One Confianza, confidence. Colonel Alistair Vance, the lead overseer from the largest regional plantation, assembled his force quickly. 35 men, including professional trackers from Georgia and Virginia, accompanied by a pack of 7 highly prized hounds known for their relentless tracking capabilities. They were confident. They had the numbers, the firepower, and the law on their side. They believed that by nightfall of the second day, Cora would be located, starved, and easily subdued. Their confidence was based on a flawed assumption that Cora would run away from the immediate area. Instead, she performed a wide, calculated loop, Keeping close to the outer perimeter of the plantation she knew best, using the smoke and the chaos of the burning harvest as perfect, natural cover. The first subtle signs that something was desperately wrong began almost immediately after they crossed the initial line of trees. The professional trackers swore they were following a fresh trail, yet every 2 miles the trail markers they had been trained to look for, a broken branch, a scuff mark, were consistently reversed or led toward terrain that was inexplicably denser and more difficult than necessary. They were being lured onto the wrong side of the tidal flow, forcing them to carry their equipment and weary horses through deep mud that should have been dry marshland. Vance dismissed the anomalies as beginner errors by his local recruits, but the strain was visible. The relentless humidity, typically manageable by experienced hunters, felt magnified, somehow heavier, causing the men to sweat through their thick woolen coats in less than an hour. Their carefully planned stops for water and rest became points of contention. The well they expected to use near the old abandoned mill house was inexplicably fouled, not with human waste, but with a strange, oily residue and thick mud that made the water undrinkable. The water sources they relied on were systemically denied. They pressed forward, driven by the size of the bounty and the colonel's relentless anger, but the pace was agonizingly slow. The confidence began to erode into frustration. This transition marked the beginning of Onda 2, Erosome. Erosion. The erosion was physical and psychological. Cora was not engaging them directly. She was allowing the environment, coupled with her subtle tactical adjustments, to do the work. The first major loss involved the horses. By the end of the 3rd day, 4 of the 7 pursuit horses were effectively neutralized. One had suffered a severe, documented consequence after stumbling over a low, intentionally placed obstacle that appeared to be natural root growth. The professional bounty hunter riding it was left isolated and tasked with walking the limping animal back 12 miles through the swamp. 2 others became violently ill after consuming the contaminated feed Cora had intentionally left for them, forcing the entire forward team to halt for half a day while managing the sick animals. For a pursuit where time was the only true currency, this delay was devastating. Then came the hounds. The dogs, bred for aggression and relentless tracking, became the greatest psychological casualty. They were not eliminated by physical harm. They were broken by sensory overload and confusion. Cora used the natural oils and pungent flora of the swamp, herbs and crushed roots known to disrupt canine olfactory senses, to confuse the trail. She crossed streams multiple times, ensuring she left no trace, but scattering misleading, intense scents that caused the hounds to thrash in confusion, baying desperately at false trails. The climax of the erosion phase occurred deep within the dense cypress wilderness. 3 trackers, having separated themselves in their frustration to follow what they believed was a clear shortcut, encountered one of Cora's tactical defenses. They were not met with a physical confrontation, but with a total, silent neutralization of their communication system. Their preset visual markers, flags, ribbons, and small cuts on trees designed to guide their return, were subtly altered, reversed, or completely removed over a large area. They became geographically isolated almost instantaneously. When the main party finally located the designated rendezvous point hours later, the 3 men were gone. They had not been attacked violently. They had been swallowed by the terrain, expertly guided into deeper, less navigable sections of the wilderness by Cora's precise alterations to their own map of return. The fear that settled over Colonel Vance's men was the chilling realization that they were not chasing a frantic, unskilled runaway. They were navigating a landscape that had been meticulously weaponized against them by an unseen force. The remaining men started looking over their shoulders. Every snapping twig, every sudden splash in the dark water became the sound of Cora closing in. they realized that their primary assets, their numbers and their technology, were liabilities in the swamp. The heavy rifles weighed them down, the group size made them easier to track, and their reliance on linear thinking made them predictable targets for her logistical sabotage. The psychological toll was immense. The documentary evidence shows that men started suffering from severe paranoia, mistaking the natural sounds of the swamp for coded signals. Sleep became impossible. This terror pushed the operation into Onda 3, collapse. Colonel Vance was now leading a demoralized, shrinking group of men who no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet or the water they drank. They were no longer hunters. They were survivors constantly on edge. Cora's strategy shifted from denial to active tactical disruption. She used the natural acoustics of the dense canopy to her advantage. By carefully setting off small, contained fires, far from the main pursuit group, but close enough for the smoke to be smelled, and using carefully placed resonant objects to mimic the sounds of approaching cavalry or large animals, she amplified their already frayed nerves. She created the constant threat of immediate confrontation, without ever initiating one, driving the men into exhaustion through endless, needless vigilance. The documentation from the subsequent inquest showed the results of this calculated psychological assault. They stopped moving effectively. Communication between the 4 supporting towns, which had relied on riders making it through the heavily forested routes, utterly failed. Cora had ensured that those routes were riddled with minor yet debilitating tactical hazards, enough to ensure riders were delayed, injured, or forced to abandon their mission. The logistical chain was broken. When the colonel finally ordered a partial retreat, a desperate attempt to resupply and regain equilibrium, the collapse was swift. The men moved erratically, abandoning valuable supplies and even equipment in their haste. The professional bounty hunters, realizing the mission was doomed and their lives were at risk of complete isolation, began to scatter, each prioritizing their own survival. The pursuit, which had started with such swagger and confidence, had dissolved into individual, terrified flight. The tactical evidence later recovered spoke volumes: abandoned heavy weapons, discarded tracking gear, and detailed maps of the territory that had been rendered completely useless by Cora's subtle alterations. The 4 towns, reliant on the success of this large-scale pursuit to secure the rest of their threatened harvest, watched as their system imploded. Cora's superior intelligence and meticulous preparation had turned the vast, unforgiving South Carolina swamp into the most sophisticated, silent defense system imaginable. She did not defeat 35 men through direct confrontation. She defeated them by orchestrating the systemic and psychological failure of their entire operational structure. The how of Cora's last stand was superior intellectual warfare. She treated the pursuit not as a chase, but as a complex logistical problem, and she solved it by sabotaging the pursuer's fundamental needs: clean water, reliable transport, rest, and, most critically, a unified sense of reality. She did not need to draw blood to ensure their documented consequences. She merely needed to introduce profound, unending paranoia and geographical disorientation. The legacy of this event, preserved in scattered local records and whispered oral tradition, was immediate and devastating. The burning of the harvest was merely the prelude. The subsequent total demoralization of the largest organized pursuit force in the region meant that for months afterward, any fugitive movement became possible. Cora had not just escaped. She had proven that the system could be choked, one calculated silent step at a time, bringing 4 prosperous towns to their knees through fear and the systemic failure of their own arrogance. The reckoning Uraki was complete, and the wilderness had won. 1863, the South Carolina Low Country. 150 armed men against 1. The paradox of the pursuit of Cora was not simply the imbalance of numbers, it was the impossible geometry of the confrontation. The pursuers, driven by the desperation of 4 crumbling towns, Crestwood, Harmony Creek, New Bethel and St. Giles, represented the collective economic and social inertia of the established order. They were hunting a ghost, a logistical failure embodied in human form. You are about to discover how this solitary figure transformed that very system into her own weapon, utilizing meticulous planning, deep understanding of the geography, and the inherent arrogance of those who sought to reclaim what they believed they owned. The records, fragmented and often self-serving, speak of tactics, of survival, and of a reckoning that went far beyond the simple recapture of a fugitive. The fear, initially a subtle tremor when the first harvest burned, had become a consuming wildfire among the planters and the hired bounty hunters. They had already endured the loss of the primary food supply, the humiliation of the first and second waves of tactical exhaustion, and the profound realization that the wilderness itself was a calculated accomplice. What remained was a final, desperate offensive, the largest organized sweep the Low Country had seen, financed not by justice, but by the immediate paralyzing threat of starvation and total economic ruin. The overseers and the remaining planters knew that if Cora was not neutralized immediately, the entire region would face systemic failure before the next planting season could even begin. This final assault began with the cold determination of men who had nowhere left to retreat. They pushed deep into the swamp, the most hostile of characters in this narrative, convinced that exhaustion must surely have brought Cora to a physical breaking point. They believed they were cornering prey. They were walking into a brilliantly staged execution of logistics. The final phase of Cora's operation was not about running, nor was it about direct confrontation. It was about absolute control of the environment and the swift, silent removal of the remaining pillars supporting the search effort. Weeks earlier, perhaps even months, while meticulous eyes were focused on fields and ledger books, Cora had been mapping the terrain not just for routes of escape, but for points of vulnerability in the hunter's supply chain. The geography of the South Carolina swamp is a labyrinth of brackish water and dense, suffocating vegetation, a living organism designed to absorb sound and energy. The pursuing forces relied on established logging trails and narrow river paths, arteries of civilization that Cora knew intimately. This last push, Onda 3, was characterized by an unnerving, palpable silence. The pursuers expected noise, the thrashing of a hurried escape, the panicked shouts of a cornered person. Instead, they encountered only meticulously manufactured emptiness. First, the water. The heat of the Low Country in 1863 was a weapon itself, requiring constant hydration. The search parties, divided into small, manageable squads to cover the vast territory, relied on specified watering holes and small, pre-dug wells established by the local plantations near the border of the wilderness. They documented the sickness that began to spread quickly. Not a plague, but a debilitating nausea and exhaustion that crippled their movement and eroded morale. While we cannot detail the mechanism, the documented result was a sudden, widespread incapacity to maintain the pace or focus of the pursuit. The records speak only of tainted supplies and unfit consumption. It was a silent, strategic withdrawal of essential resources. Next came the structural collapse. Critical, smaller bridges used for moving supplies and relaying messages, bridges that allowed the search perimeter to shrink, were found systematically, meticulously sabotaged. Not blown up, which would attract attention, but rendered useless by the precise removal of key support beams, making them unstable under the weight of a mule or a cart. The result was inertia. Teams that were supposed to rendezvous could not. Information that needed to be relayed did not arrive until it was irrelevant. The bounty hunters, men hardened by the pursuit of profit, began to fracture. They were accustomed to tracking individuals who reacted emotionally, who made mistakes born of panic. Cora's campaign was one of relentless, cold logic. The psychological horror of the final stand lay in the realization that every tactical failure they experienced was not due to luck or chance, but due to a design implemented weeks or months prior. The final night of the structured pursuit became the pinnacle of this psychological operation. Disoriented by illness and frustrated by logistical blockades, the remaining larger forces established a final perimeter, believing they had finally pinned Cora against the deepest, most inaccessible part of the swamp, a place known locally as the Dead Mire. It was here, surrounded by the oppressive darkness and the ceaseless murmuring drone of the marsh, that the hunter became the hunted without ever seeing her face. False signals began to appear, carefully constructed decoys leading patrols deep into impassable thickets, only to find an abandoned jacket or a cache of spoiled rations. Just enough evidence to fuel hope and just enough distraction to burn their precious daylight. The terror peaked with the coordinated dispersal of the remaining plantation stores, a final devastating blow to the local economy. While the men were miles deep in the mire, focusing their last ounce of effort on a location they were certain Cora occupied, reports began filtering back through the shattered communication lines. Small, critical caches of stored goods, seed grain intended for the next planting, reserves of salt and tobacco, and most critically, documentation necessary for future land claims and warrants, were found either ruined by water ingress or consumed by controlled, localized fires. Cora was not fighting to kill. She was fighting to dismantle the administrative and economic structure that governed the lives of everyone in those 4 towns. The burning of the harvest was the catalyst. The calculated destruction of the logistical and documentation reserves was the fatal blow. The realization settled upon the weary men like the thick, suffocating morning fog of the Low Country. The fight was over. Cora had not just escaped, she had achieved a total systemic collapse of the pursuit structure. They were beaten not by superior force, but by superior intelligence, patience, and an understanding of the terrain that transcended mere navigation. It was a deep, symbiotic relationship with the wilderness. The retreat was documented not as a tactical withdrawal, but as a flight driven by tactical exhaustion and absolute psychological defeat. The records of St. Giles note that by the 3rd week of the final push, the remaining overseers spent more time organizing internal security against potential uprising and guarding the remaining pitiful reserves than they did pursuing the fugitive. Cora had brought them to their knees, fulfilling the promise of the burning harvest, economic paralysis, and the dissolution of centralized control. The enduring question, the very motor of the legend that survived the war and the subsequent societal upheaval, was how? How could one person, operating alone and with limited resources, achieve such a massive strategic victory against the resources of 4 wealthy towns backed by the implicit threat of the Fugitive Slave Act? The answer lies in the subtle mastery of anticipation. Cora did not merely react to the pursuit, she dictated it. First, the deep tactical mapping. Long before the desperate flight, Cora possessed an unparalleled knowledge of the swamp's hidden channels, the specific drainage patterns, and the precise timing of the tides, knowledge gleaned from years of forced labor and observation. While the bounty hunters relied on rough sketches and paid local informants, Cora utilized the terrain as a personal, dynamic map, a living encryption key. Second, the cache network. The success was contingent upon a decentralized supply system. While the pursuers searched for one massive hideout, Cora had established dozens of small, strategically placed caches weeks prior, each stocked minimally with dry powder, non-perishable foods, and tools. These caches were often placed near the very paths the hunters were forced to take, allowing Cora to monitor their movements while refreshing supplies with minimal risk. The sophistication of this preparation showed foresight far exceeding the immediate need for survival. It was preparation for a long-form siege. Third, the exploitation of inertia. Cora understood that the structured pursuit, while numerically superior, required constant, uninterrupted momentum. By strategically destroying single, critical components, a single bridge, a single well, a single dispatch rider's route, she forced the entire machine to grind to a halt. When the machine stopped, the human element, fatigue, illness, and paranoia took over. The planters' reliance on rigid, systematic authority became their greatest weakness, a weakness Cora weaponized brilliantly. Cora's last stand did not end in a dramatic cinematic shootout. It ended in silence, in fog, and in the overwhelming realization that she was simply gone. There were no remains found, no definitive evidence of capture or death that satisfied the formal requirements of the authorities. The bounty remained unclaimed, a testament to the comprehensive failure of the entire endeavor. The consequences for the 4 towns were catastrophic. The loss of the primary harvest, combined with the intentional destruction of seed stock and critical documentation, plunged the region into a severe economic depression that predated the final Union advance by months. Historians often overlook these local internal collapses, attributing the region's total economic failure entirely to the war itself. Yet the local records reveal a distinct period of panic and scarcity in late 1863, the Cora scar, where essential goods vanished, and the internal labor system teetered on the brink of revolt due to the perceived vulnerability of the ruling class. The story of Cora, the fugitive who burned the harvest and brought 4 towns to their knees, was not preserved in the proud archives of the planting families naturally. It was preserved in the deep recesses of the oral tradition, passed down in hushed tones across generations in the cabins and fields of the Low Country. She became a symbol, a tactical blueprint for resistance, proof that intellect and deep knowledge of the land could overcome brute force and numerical superiority. The legend maintains that after the bounty hunters dispersed, broken and defeated, Cora simply walked out of the dead mire, moving north, not with fanfare, but with the quiet competence of someone who had completed a necessary task. Her legacy is not just one of escape, but of comprehensive, targeted destruction of a system of control. Cora proved that true freedom was not merely the act of running away, but the calculated dismantling of the infrastructure designed to reclaim you. The 4 towns recovered slowly, but the psychological scar remained, a permanent, chilling awareness that the wilderness held secrets deeper than their control, and that even the most vulnerable individuals, armed with superior intelligence, could initiate a total reckoning. The fields grew back. The records were slowly reconstructed, but the silence where the harvest once stood and the memory of the logistical collapse served as a perpetual unspoken monument to the woman who used the system's own weight to crush it. Her stand was definitive, her disappearance total, and the historical shadow she cast across that slice of South Carolina in 1863 remains profound, a testament to resistance planned not in fury, but in meticulous, terrifying calm.